Why do some churches remarry divorcees and others don't? Why do some churches teach tithing and other churches teach giving? Why all these differences between one church and another? Why do some people or some Christians keep Sunday a special day, and why do others not? All these varieties come out of the same Bible. Why do some churches divide people into clergy and laity, a kind of professional Christian and amateur Christian, while other churches, everybody's the same? And so it goes on. And the answer lies in the word covenant and what we understand that word to mean. Or at least a very simple question: how many covenants are there in the Bible? Some Christians say 1. Some say 2. Some say 3. Some say 5. And some say 7. And that's why there are so many differences among us. Just how many are there? Well, I'm going to deal with 5. The 5 major covenants in the Bible. But before we do that, let's ask, what do we mean by the word covenant? What is a covenant? It is a binding agreement between 2 people or 2 parties that has mutual obligations written into it. But there's something else that's like that in our lives, and that's a contract. And the first thing I must do this morning is to try and explain to you the difference between a contract and a covenant. Most of our lives are built around contracts. We pay somebody to do something and they do it because we pay them to do it. We have a contract with them. That's an equally binding bond between 2 groups or 2 parties or 2 persons. And all business is done on contract. But I'm going to show you that the one thing you cannot do is have a contract with God. You can have a covenant with God, but never a contract. So we must explore the difference between them. Supposing I want to build a house or have a house built for our family. I find a builder and we discuss terms, we bargain. I want to know how much time he will take and how much it'll cost, and he wants to know other things from me, and we are 2 equal parties negotiating between us. It is a bilateral agreement. And when we finally bargained with each other, we sign a contract that settles it for both of us. It's because we are equal partners. We each have something that the other needs. I have money which the builder needs, and he has the skill and the material and the labor which I need. So we each have something which the other party needs. And we work it all out, and then we seal it, sign it, and it's settled. And if either party reneges on the contract and doesn't do what they've agreed, the other party is released from the contract, and it's cancelled. Now, all that is a contract, and we're very used to that. If either breaks his word, the other is released. And it's as simple as that. Though I wish all contracts were as simple. But nothing of that is a covenant. A covenant is between 2 unequal partners, one of them not needing anything from the other. So there can be no negotiation, no bargaining, no settling between 2 different claims and two different offers. Because the simple fact is, you have nothing that God needs. And so you are not in a position to make a bargain with him. One of my favorite texts is in Psalm 50, where God says, if I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you. I love to preach on that, but I've never heard anyone else preach on it. You probably know the next verses. God says, if I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you, because the cattle on 1,000 hills are mine, and all the silver and the gold is mine. All the gold in South Africa, God already owns. Did you realize that? So you cannot ever say, God, if you do this for me, I'll do that for you. But how many people do that? People who are desperately sick. God, if you'll only get me better, I'll go to church for the rest of my life. People say things like this. I remember a man in our church in England who had been in World War II as a soldier, and in the middle of a very fierce battle, he said, God, if you will get me safely home to my family, I'll go to church every Sunday. And he got home safely to his family, but he didn't go to church every Sunday. And he came to church with his wife. She brought him along one Sunday, and suddenly he remembered his bargain with God. And he came to me after the service and he said, David, can I have a second bite at the cherry? I said, you can, but not on your terms. Not on that kind of basis you tried before, because you can't bargain with God. And so he eventually surrendered to the Lord and entered into a covenant with God. And he served the Lord for the rest of his life. You cannot have a contract with God. A man called Jacob tried to do that, running away from home after deceiving his blind father. He said, Lord, if you will bring me safely back to the family one day, I'll give you a tithe of all that I possess. Now that was Jacob's idea, and he was bargaining. He did get home to his family, but on the way home, God met with him and broke him. He wrestled with God, and God pulled his leg out of joint, his hip joint, and he limped for the rest of his life. God was meeting him in a covenant. The contract didn't work, but the covenant did. And Jacob became Israel, and his descendants are still in the world, and the name is still on the map, because they're in a covenant relationship with God, not a contract. A covenant is much more secure. Now, could I ask a question? I'm going to ask you to answer me with your hand in a vote. Do you think marriage is a contract or a covenant? Now think very carefully before you put your hand up. How many of you think marriage is a contract? 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't be frightened. A sprinkling. How many of you think it's a covenant? Most of you. How many of you don't like putting your hand up in church? All right. Well, we've taken a vote. And it tells me that most of you are totally out of tune with society. Because the real truth is that society around us is moving quickly from marriage as a covenant to marriage as a contract. That's why so many are breaking up. Why family life is under threat. Because there's a great shift in opinion. In the Bible, God calls marriage a covenant. but today it's a contract. And the reason is because when marriage began, it was between unequal partners. There was a stronger partner called the bridegroom and the weaker partner called the bride. And even today there's a vestige of that inequality. For example, the bride's father gives the bride away, I presume still in some marriages here. And the bride takes the bridegroom's name. And so there was an inequality. And to this day, it's understood that the man proposes to the woman. All that is a legacy of the day when it was an unequal covenant, an offer from the stronger to the weaker. And in a covenant, the weaker partner only has the choice to accept or reject. They can't bargain. No conditions. It's simply an offer of a covenant relationship from the man to the woman, and she can refuse it or accept it, but that's all. Nowadays, it's considered that you are two equals, and you can decide whether the bride takes the bridegroom's name. You can have a prenuptial agreement as to who gets the money if they divorce. And that's decided before marriages today. That's contract. And it means that if one partner doesn't keep their side of the covenant, the other is released. And that's a totally different concept. It's a contract. There was a man in the north of England whose wife, shortly after their marriage, got into bad ways. She left him and went off with another man, and another man, and another, and another. And she lived a dissolute, undisciplined life, and she paid the price, and she went down and down and down. And the man, the husband, who was a Christian, his friends said, you know, she's no good for you. She's never been any good. Get a divorce and find a good Christian partner that will be a helpmeet for you. She's no good. Get a divorce. And he turned on them and said, never speak to me like that about my wife. She's my wife, and I will love her as long as there's breath in her body. And he did. She died very shortly afterwards as the result of her living, and he was there. His hands spread over her in love, praying for her. That's a covenant. You begin to understand. When marriage is merely a contract, you just call it a day if you fall in love with someone else, or even if you just fall out of love with your partner. The contract's broken. I'm free. And you know, that's one of the most serious things that is happening in the evangelical churches all over the world. Even prominent ministries are changing their wives. I'm going to be speaking about that next week in Joburg, because it's one of the biggest issues where the church is going along with the world. We Christians should be showing the world that when we marry, we stay with it, because God stays with us, and we understand covenant. It's one of the ways in which the church is letting Jesus down, but I mustn't get into that. I'm going to deal with it later, and there will be recordings for you. But it's a big, big issue among Christians who should know better now. We'll leave it there, that subject. But I think I've conveyed to you the difference between a covenant and a contract. Now, the one making a covenant can decide the conditions. And you can make an unconditional covenant, which applies whether the other party keeps their side or not. Or you can make a conditional covenant, in which case, if the other party doesn't keep the conditions, then the benefits of the covenant do lapse. And God makes covenants with people, and some of them have no conditions, and some of them do. Let me look at another area of daily life that brings it across. Marriage, as I say, is becoming more and more of a contract, so it's not a very good illustration. But there is one thing we do in life that is a covenant and a very good illustration of what a covenant is. And that's when we make a will, leaving our property or our money to someone else. And there is another word we use at the same time, which is a synonym for covenant, a word with the same meaning, and it's the word testament. Do you use that here? Make your last will and testament. It's the same word, last will and covenant. And that's why the Bible is called by the names New and Old Testaments, New and Old Covenants. I'll come back to that because that's very misleading. Whoever labeled the two parts of the Bible, Old and New Covenant, was really misleading us. Nevertheless, that's what it means. Now, when you make a covenant, you make it freely. There is no bargaining. You decide what you are going to do to bless somebody else with money or property. Mostly, wills are unconditional and will be carried through whatever the person is like or does. And once you've signed it and sealed it and witnessed it, it's settled. You can legally add a codicil later or alter it later, but even that is settled once it's witnessed. And once you're dead, nobody can alter it, or they shouldn't be able to. Or you can make a will conditional. I leave my nephew all my money on condition that he changes his name to mine and keeps the family name going. That's a conditional will. Or I leave all my money to my daughter, which she cannot touch until she's 21. That's a conditional will. So, but you have made it, and the legatee cannot alter it and cannot decide the terms. They can reject what we leave them, or they can accept it, but they can't alter it. That's a much better illustration of a covenant or a testament. I think I've said enough now for you to realize the difference. And God, because He is so much greater than we are, and because everything belongs to Him anyway, and because He doesn't need anything from you, He makes a covenant. And He decides whether it's conditional or unconditional, and all we can do is accept or reject. We can say yes, we can say no. We can do nothing to earn it. We can do nothing to bargain for it or deserve it. As with wills, it is freely done, voluntarily done. When you make a will, you bind yourself to someone else to do something for them, and you do it out of your goodwill. Well, now that's the difference between contract and covenant, and I think I've now persuaded you exactly what the difference is. So let us now think that God is a covenant-making God. And isn't that amazing? That He should voluntarily bind himself to human beings and put himself under strict obligation to them. That Almighty God, the creator of heaven and earth, should do that to any of us. It is a marriage, and he is the bridegroom and we are the bride. That is the extraordinary thing about God, that he loves to make covenants with little human beings. And it's amazing, not only because of the difference in size between us, that we are so small and he is so great, but that we are sinners too. Rebels caught with weapons in our hands. That holy God should make a covenant with sinful human beings is astonishing. It should almost cause us to worship him and thank him. That he should tie himself to human beings, even taking their name. Here's the bridegroom taking the bride's name, for he will always be known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or to give them their Hebrew names, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov. That God should take human names himself and tie himself to the Jews forever. It's just incredible. But he's a covenant-making God. Luther once said that if I'd been God, I'd have kicked the world to pieces ages ago. And that God should bind himself to weak, sinful people such as we are and tie himself to us and bind himself to obligations to keep that covenant. It's amazing. Yet the very secret of Christ's death is that he was shedding his blood for a new covenant. So with the word covenant, we're right at the heart of the Bible. We're at the heart of God. We're touching something that is crucial. And God has persisted in making covenants. As I've said, we're going to look at 5 major covenants in Scripture which God has made. There were others, minor ones, but major ones, 5. And we look at them one by one. But behind them all was this promise: I will be their God, and they will be my people. Interesting little phrase, I will. If you underline your Bible, I'm afraid I do, it's just full of colors and lines and all sorts of things. And when the Bible gets worn, isn't it awful letting it go? This was falling to pieces, and the pages were just falling out whenever I opened it. And I was so reluctant to buy a new Bible because it was like an old pair of shoes. It fitted me so well. And then I went to Romania earlier this year, and a man in the congregation noticed my Bible was falling to bits, and he said, "Give me that Bible." And I gave it to him, and he brought it back 3 hours later, all mended, all whole. I said, you couldn't have given me anything better. That's the best present I've had in years. My old Bible back again. Well, if you have a Bible like that and you underline it, underline those 2 words, I will. You'll be absolutely astonished. The whole Bible is a marriage service. And God says, I will. On some pages, it's almost every verse. I will, I will, I will. And that's what I said at my marriage. It's called the longest sentence in the English language. I will. And it is. But God was always using those 2 words. And he made promise after promise after promise to those he had a covenant with. And we are benefiting from those promises even today. I will. Why did God make covenants? What's behind it all? The answer is very simple. By the way, I'm struggling with my voice. Please pray for my voice these few days. I've picked up something probably on the plane coming. That's where I pick things up. It's just a bit hoarse. Well, the reason behind it all is this. I've often been asked the question, why did God create human beings? What did he have in mind? Why are we here? And my answer to that question is completely simple. It's this: God already had one son, and he enjoyed that so much, he wanted a bigger family. Now, I can't explain it any more simple than that, but that's what God was after. He wanted a bigger family. He wanted more sons and daughters. And that's why we're here. That's why every human being is on earth. The New Testament tells us he put us here to seek him, to get into a relationship with him. And if a man or a woman reaches the end of life without finding that relationship, they've missed the reason for life itself, which is tragic. We're not here to make money. We're not here to enjoy ourselves. All that's incidental. We're here to get into relationship with God and join his family. That's why we're here. And the only hope for people like us, who by nature don't want to be in that family, by nature don't want a relationship with God, the only hope for us is if God takes the initiative and makes covenants with us, which he has done. So God is a covenant-making God. But he's more than that. He's a covenant-keeping God. And that's more valuable to us. If God makes a promise, he will keep it. You can trust his word. You very quickly find in life that you can't trust other people's words. And some have more experience of that than others. But people are not totally trustworthy. And they can say things and not mean them. But if God makes a promise, when he says, I will, you can utterly rely on that word. That's what faith means. It's nothing more nor less than relying on God's word and believing that he means what he says and says what he means. And that's the way to approach the Bible. To believe that it means what it says and it says what it means, because God is behind it. And God doesn't tease, God doesn't bully, God doesn't play games with people. And we mustn't play games with him on our side. So God is a covenant-keeping God. And therefore he makes his covenants very solemn affairs. Would you have heard the word used of marriage, that it is solemnized? What an interesting word. When you meet and make your promises and vows to each other, you are solemnizing. It's a very solemn occasion, very serious. It's a very big occasion. I don't know if you were like me, but I didn't understand what I was saying at my wedding. Did you? I said the words after the minister, and I said, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death us do part. I didn't realize what I said. I do now. We've been married 54 years. And she's put up with me for all that time. That's a miracle. Do you know, in New Zealand, we were in a little meeting and we were asked, what is the secret of being happily married for 36 years, which it was then. And do you know what my wife said? She said straight away, it's because we're both in love with the same man. And we got outside the room and I said, I was the only person in that room who knew who you meant. But we are in a covenant relationship, not a contract, and she's put up with it because she made a promise. I will. And God keeps his promise. So that's why he solemnizes his covenants. Now, there are different ways of solemnizing. One is to swear, and to swear by a greater power than yourself. You are then calling on that greater power to destroy you if you don't keep your promise. So when you say, by God, I'll do this, you are calling on God to do something terrible to you if you don't keep your word. In a court of law in England, you have to swear on the Bible. Do you have to do that here? I swear by Almighty God that I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I'm afraid it's now a formality. People don't realize what they're doing when they do that. They're saying, God, kill me if I don't tell the truth, and the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's a very solemn thing to do. And God swears when he makes a covenant. He can't swear by a greater power than himself. He can't say, by God, I'll do this. So he says, by myself, I will do this. You ever notice that? God has to swear by himself because there is nothing greater. But he is swearing and saying, I'll destroy myself if I don't keep this. And that's what he did with some of the covenants in the Bible. He swore that he would keep them. That makes them very solemn indeed. But the other way he makes it solemn is to sign with his blood. Make a blood covenant. Do you know, in some tribes of the world, when a man and a woman marry, they cut the palm of the hands with a knife, and when they're flowing with blood, they take the bridegroom's hand and bind it to the bride's hand. And the covenant in blood binds them because they are saying, my life, if I don't break the promise. And that is also found in Scripture. The covenant with Abraham was a blood covenant. A sacrifice was made. And God passed between the parts of a slain animal to settle the covenant. And of course that idea is picked up in the New Testament when Jesus said, this is my blood of the new covenant, my life of the new covenant, my bloodshed. There's another interesting parallel between a last will and testament and the New Testament. And it is this: the book of Hebrews says, a will cannot come into effect until the person who's made it dies. And the new covenant, says Hebrews, is exactly the same. It could not come into effect until Jesus died. So we're seeing a whole lot of things, but the important point I'm making now is that a covenant needs to be solemnized, sealed in some special way that settles it, having been made. And that applies to the covenants of the Bible too. Now we are at last in a position to study the covenants of the Bible. And I've given you a sheet of paper, and now you can all go home and study this, and you'll get everything I'm going to tell you. Start with the chart side that's divided up into a lot of little squares. And everything I want to say now is on this side of the paper. Top left-hand corner, the biblical covenants. Under that, going down the left-hand column, we have 5 major covenants in the Bible. And they're all named after one of the parties to the covenant. The first is called the Noahic covenant because it was made with Noah and others, as we shall see in a moment, but it was made with Noah. The next was made with Abraham, so we call it the Abrahamic. The next with Moses, we call it the Mosaic. The next with King David, which we call the Davidic covenant. And the final one, the covenant made by Jesus, which we call the Messianic covenant. Messiah, same as the word Christ. Messiah is Hebrew, Christ is Greek. It's the same one, and it means anointed king. And so we have finally the Messianic covenant. And I want you to notice a very important point, which we'll explore later, that only one of those 5 is called Old. And this is where the title Old Testament is so misleading. Only one of the covenants in the Old Testament is old, and that's the one with Moses. And in the New Testament, that's the one that's called the Old Covenant. The Noahic, the Abrahamic, the Davidic are not called old because they still apply, and we benefit from them. But the Mosaic is the old one. And notice that only one of the 5 is called the new one, in contrast to the old one, and that's the Messianic, the new covenant, as we call it. Now that's the left-hand column. Now let's go across the top. Looking at the biblical covenants from 6 points of view. First of all, who? Who was the covenant made with? They were all made by God, but who did he make them with? Who benefits from that covenant? That's the party involved. Next, we look at the promise in each covenant, where God says, I will. What is he offering? What is he leaving to people? What is he giving to people? The promise. The next is the proviso. What is expected of those with whom he is making the covenant? Are they expected to do anything? Next, the penalty attached to the covenant, if there is one. With some there isn't one. They are what we call unconditional. Others are conditional. What will happen to the other party if they break the covenant and fail to keep the provisions, fail to keep up their obligations? Fifthly, what period of time is covered by the covenant? Is it permanent? Is it temporary? Is it only for a short time, or is it for a very long time? And finally, what is the purpose of the covenant, Each covenant has a particular reason. The why. Why did God do this at that time to those people with that promise and with those provisos and with that penalty? Why? Now that covers all the ground we want to cover this morning. It's quite a lot. So let's make a start. After the flood, God made a covenant with Noah and with his family, 3 sons and 3 daughters-in-law, and his wife. 8 souls were saved from the flood, which destroyed a very sinful generation of people. We know what was happening that caused the flood. We can sum it up in 2 words: perverted sex and violence. And they go together. Because if you don't treat people as people, you treat them as objects, and violence is the result. Perverted sex invariably leads to violence. They go together. And the perverted sex in those days was an extraordinary relationship, physical relationship, between angels and human beings. That idea may seem extraordinary to you, but you see, God has created us in orders. Angels are higher than we are. They're superior to us in beauty and strength and intelligence. Then come human beings made a little lower than the angels. And then come animals who are under the dominion of human beings. And God very clearly forbids sexual intercourse between those 3 levels. We are more familiar today because it's returning, even on your screens, of sex with animals. And God hates that. Sex with angels we're not so familiar with, but it's possible. And God is equal. We have sexual relations within our order, not outside it. And we need to remember that. Well, that's what was happening. And it led to a violent society. And you can see that today. We are living in a violent world. I noticed your houses here have bars on the ground floor windows. I'm not used to that in Britain. But it tells me something. There's violence. And we are going to see an increasingly violent world as people become more godless. And it often begins when men and women treat each other as objects and not subjects. You follow me? Well, God was so disgusted with all that he decided to wipe it out and start again. But he found one family who were living right. That's what righteous means in that context. And he saved them. And then after the Holocaust, he said, I make a covenant with you and with your descendants. And therefore it's a covenant with the whole human race. And we wouldn't be here this morning if God hadn't kept that covenant. Because it's a covenant for our survival, our physical survival. And it's a promise of God that he would keep the seasons going. Springtime and harvest, summer and winter. And he promised to keep that going. And that's why we're cool this morning. Because God kept his promise. And when I was tempted to grumble a bit this morning because I was feeling a bit cold, I thought, but God is keeping his promise. Why should I grumble? And he has kept it. Because it's from those seasons that our food comes. And we couldn't survive without those seasons. I was on Australian television once, trying to think of the man's name. It'll come back to me. And it was just after the great famine in Ethiopia. Darren Hinch, does that mean anything to you? And he was so angry with God. He said, what is God doing to let so many innocent children in Ethiopia die of famine, hunger? And I said, Darren, did you know that the United Nations Food Organization has issued a report this very year that there is enough food in the world for everybody? For every man, woman, and child to go to bed satisfied. I said, the problem isn't with God. It's with us because we don't share it. And he was silent then. I think later he found himself in prison. It's amazing how many people blame God, but God has kept his part. And there will always be enough food in the world for every human being. There has been every year so far, but it's all being swallowed up by only part of the human race who have problems with obesity, whereas others starve. God has done his bit. Do you expect God to provide a food parcel on every doorstep? He provides the food, and he says, you share it. Praise God. There is no reason why anybody should go to bed hungry. And yet a third of the world go to bed hungry and another third go to bed starving. Don't blame God. God promised to give us the seasons. And that promise Jesus took up in the Sermon on the Mount. And he said he sends his Son on the evil as well as the good, and the rain on the unjust as well as the just. Mind you, I've heard a little poem about that. The rain, it raineth on the just and on the unjust fella, but it raineth more so on the just, because the unjust has the just's umbrella. I like that little poem. Now forget it. But God, I came out this morning and looked at this cloudless, sunny sky. What a blessing. God keeps his promise. Now, why? Well, first of all, was there any proviso? Did God expect anything from us? And the answer is yes. There are provisos in the Noah covenant. And one is the sanctity of human life, and the other is respect for animal life. Now here's the human life. God says, I am doing my bit to preserve human life, but you must respect human life. It is sacred. And he introduced a notion which we are increasingly ignoring, the notion of capital punishment. And God laid down in that first covenant with the whole human race that he who takes the life of another must die. Life for a life. That preserves sanctity of life. It's one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not murder. I use that word because whoever kills the murderer is not guilty of breaking that commandment if it is done by society. So I believe in capital punishment for murder. And people say to me, David, would you do it? Would you press the button? Would you give the injection? Would you turn the switch of the electric chair on? Would you pull the bolt on the scaffold? And I say, and I believe it, yes, I honestly would, as an act of obedience to God. But I would never expect my wife to. That's my answer. But today there's a swing against capital punishment for murder. And it was in the 60s that my nation decided not to do it anymore. And I remember saying to my wife and to others at the time, do you know what will follow? I said, abortion will follow. And euthanasia will follow after that. Because if you abolish capital punishment, you are destroying the sacredness of human life in God's sight. Now you can discuss this with me afterwards, but my views go back to the Noah covenant, where God said, human life is in my image, and destroying any human life is destroying my image. It is, in other words, sacrilege. But in modern legal thinking, murder is theft, not sacrilege. You have stolen a life, and the punishment is therefore for serious theft. I throw that out to you. Likewise, God demanded humane killing of animals. He did at that time introduce meat to human diet. Hitherto, the race seems to have been vegetarian. And nowadays, some people are making vegetarianism almost a religion. But we have God's authority to eat meat. And therefore, we are free to do that. This covenant still applies. However, you can choose not to eat meat. You're free. But you're not choose to make it a religious principle. But when animal life and human life are treated as the same, and when you tell people they're descended from monkeys and that we're in a human zoo, then you're going to treat humans and animals the same. And you won't value humans as alone in the image of God. They're just another human animal. That's one side of it. The other is that God laid down that the blood of meat had to be released, and that you don't eat blood, because blood is the life. It may surprise you, but there are people who have eaten live flesh of animals, and humans for that matter, but animal. The requirement to drain the blood from meat was to make sure that all life had gone from the animal before it was used for food. It's a very humane requirement from one point of view. So God said you treat human life as sacred and you respect animal, and you make sure they are dead before you start cutting them up for meat. So these were the requirements, but they were not conditions, or the sun wouldn't have risen this morning, because so many people are breaking his conditions, but they were not conditions. Therefore, there was no penalty attached to the failure of human beings. The vast majority of modern states have abolished capital punishment. Not the Muslim states, but Western states have one after another abolished it, and God still sends his sun on the good and the bad, and still sends his rain. This was an unconditional covenant. However, it was a temporary one. And God said, I will keep this covenant as long as the earth remains. It is a limited period covenant. And so God will not keep it forever. Now, why did he make this? Well, because he wants the bigger family. And if he kept wiping sinners out as soon as they sin, he'll never get that family, would he? Do you follow me? And therefore he said, I'll never send a flood again. I've done it once. And I believe he did it once to remind us that he could do it any time he wished. And that our lives are totally dependent on him keeping his covenant. So he didn't do it again, and he never has done it again. But Jesus told us repeatedly that there's coming a day that will be like the days of Noah. And it'll happen again. Not in the same way, but it'll happen again. Well, now that's the Noah covenant. How am I doing for time? 10:10. When does this session end? Is it when I choose, or is there a time? No. No, what is it due? 1:30. Okay, we've got more time to go. Second covenant with Abraham. Now this has been described as the most important in the Bible. Well, I don't believe it's the most important, but it is in the Old Testament. Everything begins here. God's purpose to redeem us, to make us fit to be his family, starts with Abraham. An old man, and he was living in a comfortable brick-built home with central heating. I'm telling you the truth, actually, because they've excavated Ur of the Chaldees and shown the amazingly sophisticated brick-built two-story homes with a central fire heating the rooms. And dear old Abraham was settled in his old age in that house, and God said, get out. And he left it. And he lived in a tent for the rest of his lives, up in the hills, in the mountains, where it could be very cold. Amazing man. Would you live in your retirement in a tent rather than a brick-built warm home? But because that old man went when God told him, you're here this morning. And if he hadn't done, you wouldn't be here. Isn't that incredible? I'm looking forward to meeting that man. We owe him so much. Dear old man. And the covenant was made with his son and his grandson. 3 generations of men. What was special about them? Nothing much. They were all liars. Have you checked the story? Every one of those 3 men lied for his own welfare and good. What on earth was God doing marrying 3 men like that? Extraordinary. But they had one thing in common, and only one thing. They trusted God's word. They believed that God meant what he said. And they trusted him. And trust involves obedience. That's going to be a major thrust of my talk with the pastors here. Trust and obedience together make faith. If you trust someone, you do what they tell you. They go together. And you can't separate them. And faith means trusting God enough to believe he will do what he says and that you will do what he says. Goes together. Now this was made in Canaan, and this was made for the purpose of selection. God's great scheme to redeem the human race begins with selection. Now we had 3 children. Well, we still have, but one's in heaven now. But when they were little, I used to bring them sweets or candies every Saturday morning. And I could do it in one of 2 ways. I could give a bag of sweets to one of the 3 and say, you share that with the others. Or I could give them each a bar of chocolate or whatever. The second way was the way to have peace in the house. The first way led to endless problems. You got more than I have. That's a bigger piece than you gave me. But God's method is the first. To select some and give them what the whole human race needed and say, now you go and share it with the others. This is a real offense to many people. The philosophers call it the scandal of particularity. That's their wordy way of saying, we don't like God doing it this way. Why didn't God do it for the Americans, or the Russians, or the South Africans, or the Boers? Why did he have to do it with Jews? But that is God's way. Here it is, share it with the others. And therefore this covenant with Abraham was both national and international. The national side of the promise of God, I will give you a land in which you and your descendants can live and call their own. And I will give you seed who can occupy the land. And that is the main reason that Hillary Clinton ought to be thinking about at this moment when she's trying to cause peace between Israelis and Palestinians, because that still applies. God has never gone back on the promises to Abraham. It was almost unconditional. I'll say almost because I'll show in a moment that it wasn't quite. But he gave them seed, he gave Abraham seed and land and said, they're yours, so that I will always have a people to share my blessing with the whole world. The international side was what I've just said. And in you will all the families of the earth be blessed. So from the very beginning, Abraham was given a worldwide mandate. God had the whole human race in mind in making this special covenant with one people. And that is the case. However, he did add an extraordinary codicil to the testament, and it's this: whoever blesses you will be blessed by me, and whoever curses you, I will curse. So that our attitude to the Jewish people is one of the most important questions of life. There's a very unusual relationship between South Africa, Israel, and Holland, actually, the Netherlands. And maybe that's written into your Dutch history. The link is diamonds. Israel's biggest money earner is diamonds, cutting them. They don't have any of their own. They buy rough diamonds from here. Then they cut them and sell them on in Amsterdam, New York, and London. That's a link between your countries, which actually has a lot of influence. But South Africa has, I think, always had a very special link with the people of God called Israel. Partly perhaps because of the great trek and the feeling of identity, of being called out into other country, whatever it is. There is a special sympathy or empathy with Israel in this country that I've discovered. And it all goes back to Abraham. It was a selection of God's agency to the human race. Now, the only condition that was applied was circumcision. And God did say, if any male descendant of yours is not circumcised, he must be cut off from the people. That's the only condition. But to this day, Jews are very careful to circumcise their boys. As I said in Jerusalem, I think it shocked some people, but I said, every Israeli has the title deeds to this land inside his trousers. But I mean that. They've kept that sign of the covenant. And therefore, they've kept their part. And therefore, they're still God's people, because God didn't make any other conditions. If they failed to be circumcised, they were cut off. And if we fail to bless, or worse, curse those descendants, we are cursed. And this is permanent. It wasn't just for a time. It still applies. And that's the most important fact in the whole Middle East conflict today that needs to be remembered. But as far as I can see, politicians are ignoring that fact totally. Why did God make this covenant? He wanted a people on earth to mediate God's blessing. He was going to give them a land, and he was going to bless them more than any other nation. And then the whole world would see, look what it is to be God's people. Look how blessed you can be if you live God's way. That was the idea. And therefore he put the land at the very center of the earth, at the meeting point of Africa, Asia, and Europe, at the very corridor that joins them. The crossroads of the world, from Asia to Africa, from Arabia to Europe, is at Megiddo in northern Israel. And if you take all the landmass of the world, including the Americas, and you find the center of gravity, if you could cut it all out, but keep them joined together and get a pin in the center around which the whole landmass of the world is balanced. Do you know where the pin would be? In Jerusalem. And so he put them at the center of the world and said, now demonstrate my goodness and my blessing. The whole world goes through here, and they will see how you live and how you're blessed, and they will want to live the same way and want to be blessed too. Third covenant was made with Moses after God liberated them from slavery. Abraham's descendants got into trouble. They were slaves. They had no land of their own, no money of their own, no name of their own, nothing of their own. Not even their time was their own. And God rescued them out of all that. And then, having got them out, and having drowned Pharaoh's army, he made a covenant with them. I climbed Mount Sinai at 3 in the morning because of the heat. So I went up in the darkness and climbed that mountain. And I remembered, do you know, actually at the very top, I found a Jewish girl reading the 10 Commandments in Hebrew. And I said to her, what's your name? She said, Miriam. I said, my, you've been here a long time? That's where God made a covenant with Moses. Now, this covenant was not about giving them the land, but about keeping it. It was about their security. And God promised, I will keep you healthy in that land. I will keep you protected in that land. I will be your guardian. I'll look after you. I'll protect you. I'll provide for you on condition. And this was a very conditional covenant. Provided that you live my way and keep my commandments. Otherwise, troubles will come. And they will come in increasing measure. They will begin with disease among your crops, animals. Locusts will come and eat the crops. They will gradually build up into enemy raids from surrounding nations. They will raid you and rob you until the ultimate, I will have to kick you out of the land and you'll lose it. So while the ownership of the land is permanent, the occupation is dependent. Now, those both apply to the Middle East today. The ownership is unconditional. The occupation is conditional. And there's a balance that needs to be kept between those two. One of the conditions, one of the laws that God gave them was that the land itself needs a holiday. And every 7 years, you give the land, the soil, a holiday, a rest, a Sabbath rest. And you know they ignored that law for 500 years. So if you add up how many days holiday the land had not had, do you know what it comes to? Easy sum. 70 years. And that's why God sent them to Babylon for how long? 70 years. Everything in the Bible fits so perfectly, doesn't it? You don't give the land a holiday, I will, says God. And I've been reckoning up how many years the holiday has been missed, and 70 years, out you go for 70 years. God means what he says what he means. So the Mosaic covenant was conditional on obedience to God's laws. And when you study those laws, they cover every aspect of life. They cover food, dress, marriage, sewage, building regulations. They really tell the children of Israel, this is how your whole life is to be. And it will show the world how holy, happy, healthy living is my will for the human race. But if you break one of these, you've broken them all. Because it all hangs together. It's one law, my law. And he gave them a choice at Sinai. He said, do you accept this covenant? And do you know what they said? We will keep all these laws to do them. We will. And of course they never did. And they lost the land. But because God had a covenant with them, he always brought them back. And I have lived to see God bring them back again after the longest exile they've had. And when I studied the history of modern Israel and how it came to be, I could only say only God could do that. There's no way that man could have done what was needed. That Russia and America united to vote for Israel. The only time they ever voted together in the history of the United Nations. Up to that point, only God could achieve that. Oh, there are many other things, the biggest of which is this. Since they went back, the rain has come back to Israel. Well, now, United Nations couldn't organize that, I'm quite sure. And the highest rainfall they had for 100 years was in 1948, the year they announced the state of Israel. That's why I believe God has done something in our generation that we can point to and say, God is still alive. That's another issue. However, this Mosaic covenant was temporary. It was not permanent. And we know that from the New Testament. It was only given until Christ came. It was a schoolmaster to prepare them for him. It was part of their schooling to get ready for the big one. And this is why throughout the New Testament, the new covenant cancels the old. And it's this one. It is therefore not for us Gentile believers. It was a national covenant, only national for the people of Israel. And this covenant was to make sure that they were a living demonstration of the blessing of living God's way. And if they didn't, they would be cursed by God to demonstrate that you don't play games with God and to show that God is still against those who refuse to live his way. And so Israel has been more blessed than any other people, and they've suffered more than any other people. And the world should be looking at both those facts and learning from it that there is a God in heaven who is concerned about how we live, who wants us to be healthy, happy, holy people, but who, if we are not, must pay the bill for that. I've still got 7 minutes. No, I haven't. I can't see that clock. Perhaps just as well, but I'll call a halt there. Most important thing, I'm ready for coffee.
Avioliitto on yhden miehen ja yhden naisen välinen liitto, eli-ikäinen liitto. Ja se on, kunnes kuolema teidät erottaa. Niin kuin hääkaavassakin sanotaan, että tahdotko ottaa tämän naisen tai aviovaimon tai aviomiehen puolisoksesi, vaimoksesi, kunnes kuolema teidät erottaa. Ja siinä sanotaan tahdon. Se on tahdon asia, niin kuin se on liitto Jumalan silmien edessä luotu. Niin. Ja se on voimassa, kunnes kuolema meidät erottaa. Tässä käydään nyt näitä termejä läpi, mitä avioliitto on. Voitte itse lukea sitten Raamatusta ne paikat tarkemmin, mitä näissä kohdissa mainintoja niihin Raamatun paikkoihin. Mä en niitä nyt laita, mutta saatte itse tarvittaessa ne lukea, mitenkä ateria. Avioliitto mainitaan silläkin ilmestyskirjassa, että Jeesus on se sulhanen ja seurakunta on se morsia, mutta tämmöistä nyt tähän kertaan. Joo. Ja tämmöistä tietoa. Avioliitto on yhden miehen ja yhden naisen välinen liitto, eli-ikäinen liitto. Ja se on, kunnes kuolema teidät erottaa. Niin kuin hääkaavassakin sanotaan, että tahdotko ottaa tämän naisen tai aviovaimon tai aviomiehen puolisoksesi, vaimoksesi, kunnes kuolema teidät erottaa. Ja siinä sanotaan tahdon. Se on tahdon asia, niin kuin se on liitto Jumalan silmien edessä luotu. Niin. Ja se on voimassa, kunnes kuolema meidät erottaa. Tässä käydään nyt näitä termejä läpi, mitä avioliitto on. Voitte itse lukea sitten Raamatusta ne paikat tarkemmin, mitä näissä kohdissa mainintoja niihin Raamatun paikkoihin. Mä en niitä nyt laita, mutta saatte itse tarvittaessa ne lukea, mitenkä ateria. Avioliitto mainitaan silläkin ilmestyskirjassa, että Jeesus on se sulhanen ja seurakunta on se morsia, mutta tämmöistä nyt tähän kertaan. Joo. Ja tämmöistä tietoa. Avioliitto on yhden miehen ja yhden naisen välinen liitto, eli-ikäinen liitto. Ja se on, kunnes kuolema teidät erottaa. Niin kuin hääkaavassakin sanotaan, että tahdotko ottaa tämän naisen tai aviovaimon tai aviomiehen puolisoksesi, vaimoksesi, kunnes kuolema teidät erottaa. Ja siinä sanotaan tahdon. Se on tahdon asia, niin kuin se on liitto Jumalan silmien edessä luotu. Niin. Ja se on voimassa, kunnes kuolema meidät erottaa. Tässä käydään nyt näitä termejä läpi, mitä avioliitto on. Voitte itse lukea sitten Raamatusta ne paikat tarkemmin, mitä näissä kohdissa mainintoja niihin Raamatun paikkoihin. Mä en niitä nyt laita, mutta saatte itse tarvittaessa ne lukea, mitenkä ateria. Avioliitto mainitaan silläkin ilmestyskirjassa, että Jeesus on se sulhanen ja seurakunta on se morsia, mutta tämmöistä nyt tähän kertaan. Joo. Ja tämmöistä tietoa.